Democrats fear the truth about Biden's 2024 presidential run. A re-election campaign is a manifestly bad idea, but members of his party are too cowardly to admit it. Democrats have spent 7 years rightly excoriating Republicans for refusing to distance themselves from Donald Trump on Russian election interference, the January 6, 2021, Capitol attack, his foolish proclamations on COVID, coziness with extremists and much else. Some have even called Trump supporters Vichy Republicans. But my fellow Democrats have shown their own kind of cowardice by refusing to say that President Biden shouldn't run for re-election. Polls show most Democratic voters don't want Mr. Biden to run again, but Democratic elites apparently believe that any dissent from party leadership or independent thinking, even in the name of an obvious truth, is dangerous to their job security. To be sure, opposing Mr. Biden's 2024 run can be tricky. He is a preternatural panderer with nearly every audience, which keeps many activist groups at bay. And increasingly he comes across, even to his supporters, as a foggy retiree. Attacking him can seem ageist, even sadistic. But unlike his Democratic presidential predecessors, Mr. Biden's job approval has been consistently in the dumps, and his legislative record is debatable at best. He and his staff promised centrism but instead governed from the far left. Voters of all races, especially working-class voters, for whom Democrats claim to fight, continue to desert the party. There are 4 reasons Mr. Biden shouldn't run. First, he consistently makes embarrassing and confused misstatements on nearly every policy front: Afghanistan, glaringly inept claims about al-Qaeda's reconstitution and his general support for total withdrawal, among many others; Ukraine, the suggestion that minor incursions by Russia may be tolerated and followed by an implication that forces from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization could join the conflict; student loan forgiveness, false claims that Congress authorized it; nearly every other major policy area, and even his own life story. He's always been a gaffe machine, but the condition is worsening. The president seems frequently confused on stage, unable to identify public officials and even calling on a deceased official. None of us can imagine him surviving a press grilling without countless mistakes. An increasingly partisan mainstream news media gives Mr. Biden a pass. A few years ago, the media would have savaged any president for the mind-numbing regularity of the gaffes. Second, the Biden economy has been the worst performing of any Democratic president since Jimmy Carter by most measures. Voters have expressed strong bipartisan dissatisfaction with the worst inflation and interest rates hikes in nearly half a century after White House economic bureaucrats pushed for an additional and unneeded $2 trillion COVID stimulus, far in excess of the $400 billion shortfall in gross domestic product at the end of 2020. Many of the supposedly new jobs created under Mr. Biden are rebound jobs from the pandemic, and labor force participation is abysmally low. Retirement funds have been decimated with one of the worst-performing stock markets in memory. Mr. Biden's war against oil and gas was bungled for lack of a meaningful long-term transition plan for decarbonization, and the result only aggravated inflation. Third, while partisans in the news media would have you believe the president has significant legislative accomplishments, it's a hard case to make. The infrastructure bill was a consensus bipartisan bill years in the making. The CHIPS Act, while important, had no meaningful dissent. The Inflation Reduction Act hasn't much reduced inflation, and the bill's renewable energy subsidies, while helpful, will have a marginal impact on climate change without a more meaningful international framework on carbon reduction. Fourth, Mr. Biden promised to govern as a centrist but stayed silent until this month when local progressives pushed to defund the police and reduce prosecutions, holding fewer criminal suspects amid dramatic crime spikes in the nation's cities. The White House denied that local school administrators were pushing extremist ideas on race and gender despite mounting evidence that many are. There were nearly 3 million illegal border crossings in 2022, a record, as the White House shrugged its shoulders. The Biden administration apparently believes it got a pass on these issues because Republicans underperformed on Election Day 2022. The real reason Republicans underperformed is that Mr. Trump's election grandstanding penalized the candidates he endorsed by 5 to 7 points, and the abortion issue may have given Democrats a temporary bump. There was still a 7-point swing in the popular vote in favor of Republicans, and the election would have been a wipeout absent that Trump penalty. In the governor's race in Florida, and elsewhere across the country, Democrats saw hemorrhaging of their traditional constituencies, mostly because of concerns over the far leftward drift of the party. Democrats would be smart to find someone with the wherewithal to recognize this and right the ship. Democrats fear the truth about Biden's 2024 presidential run. A re-election campaign is a manifestly bad idea, but members of his party are too cowardly to admit it. Democrats have spent 7 years rightly excoriating Republicans for refusing to distance themselves from Donald Trump on Russian election interference, the January 6, 2021, Capitol attack, his foolish proclamations on COVID, coziness with extremists,